Hey all, Joshua Hulko here. Today I'm kicking off a new series of videos on image processing and printing, and we're going to kick it off in Photoshop, and I want to show you why everything you're doing in Photoshop is probably wrong. That's a little bit dramatic, but there is some basic settings that you need to make sure that you are doing in Photoshop to make sure that your color is correct. And if you're not doing this, then you're kind of just fumbling around in the dark and not getting anywhere. It's actually the very first thing you should do after you've calibrated your monitor, and I'll do a different video on that. There's plenty on YouTube already, but I'm going to do an up-to-date one at some point that will go through the whole process of image calibration. But for now, I want to talk about what you should do. The first thing you should do in Photoshop Creative Cloud once you have calibrated your monitor and you have opened Photoshop. So here we are in the latest version of Photoshop Creative Cloud, and it is April 2020. So I'm not sure exactly what dot version this is, but it's the latest version. So the very first thing you need to be doing is, before you do anything, before you open a photograph, before you try and sharpen, print, process, anything at all, go into Edit and go into Color Settings. So this Color Settings is where you're going to set up all of the color settings for Photoshop so that you are operating in the right gamut, in the right color space rather, and that if you're converting documents between color spaces, that you're not getting weird and wonderful wacky color shifts that are going to throw everything out. So keeping in mind, this is the very first thing you need to do. Now when you pop this for the first time, it's going to be set to North America General Purpose 2, which is generally useless. And this is where most people have left it because they don't know how to set this properly, and they're not sure how to proceed, so they just don't go into this menu, or they don't even know about it to begin with. But you need to go into here and you need to make some changes, because if you don't make changes here and you don't set these settings correctly, everything's going to be wacky and wrong. So let's talk about how we set these things properly. So the working space is basically it's currently set to sRGB, which is a very small color space. It's a very small bucket of color, if you like. sRGB is really the color space of the web. So it's great if you're wanting to share JPEGs on social media or amongst friends, or this that type of file sharing. But it's useless if you want to get the most out of your image for making prints, or for working with high resolution files where you want to maintain the maximum amount of color that's in the file. Because if you're working in the sRGB color space, basically you're going to be throwing away a whole lot of color information, and we don't want to do that. The color space I recommend you work in is ProPhoto. Now ProPhoto is a much larger color space, and is effectively the color space you're working in if you're working in Lightroom. And if you're converting files from Lightroom to Photoshop, you definitely don't want to get any color shifts. So I recommend that you work in ProPhoto. ProPhoto color space is going to give you the biggest possible bucket of color, and especially if you're making prints. With making prints today, many of the latest printers can actually print some colors outside of the Adobe RGB color space. So it's a very good idea to operate in the largest possible bucket of color. So let me just see if I can find here in our menu. There's a lot of profiles in here for all my different printers. But what we're actually looking for, it's right up here at the top, is ProPhoto RGB. So click on that, and straight away you can see it's jumped to custom. So we're now in custom, which is exactly where we want to be. We're going to save this out. So this is something you only actually going to need to do once. You do it once, you set it up properly, and then you don't need to actually do it again. So once we've got ProPhoto set as our working space, let's look at what we have to look at next. Okay, so a little tip for black and white photographers. One of the things I recommend that you do is I recommend that you match the grey working space to the gamma of your color working space, which for ProPhoto actually means you should set a grey gamma of 1.8. And if you're a black and white photographer, that's something you should definitely make sure you do. And it's just going to make sure that you don't get any tonal shifts if you're copying and pasting between color and black and white documents when you're operating in the ProPhoto color space. If you're operating in the Adobe RGB color space, the gray gamma is actually 2.2, but for ProPhoto it's 1.8. So just a little tip for black and white photographers. Okay, moving on to color management policies. I recommend personally that you preserve your embedded profiles in the RGB color space at all time. There really is no good argument I can think of these days to strip a profile from a document. Perhaps unless you were sending it off to a printer and you didn't want them to know that you knew what you were doing. That might be one reason, I guess, but I think it's, excuse me, otherwise it makes a lot of sense to just preserve embedded profiles and just leave them as they are. If you get any profile mismatches, that is, if you try and open a document, let's say in the sRGB color space, once you've set this correctly to Pro Photo, then Photoshop will pop a dialog and will warn you effectively that you're opening a document in a different color space. And I think it's a good idea to have these ticked, just so that you get a little reminder pop up to tell you that you are dealing with a document that is in a different color space to Pro Photo. And then of course you can make an intelligent decision about what you want to do with that document, whether you want to convert the document to Pro Photo or leave it in its existing color space. So I think it's worthwhile ticking these boxes unless you are dealing with a lot of documents that fall outside of the Pro Photo color space, and it's going to be popping dialogues all the time. It might drive you a bit crazy. But I think otherwise, if that's not the situation, you're better off just leaving these boxes ticked. Okay, we're going to breeze through the rest of these settings pretty quickly because there isn't much for us to do here. You have a couple of options with conversion. In the conversion options, I suggest strongly you just leave it to Adobe Ace with the intent set to relative colorimetric unless you have a very good reason to change it. Quite honestly, the relative colorimetric is probably good 80% of the time, so there really isn't much need to change this, and I would leave black point compensation and the others ticked underneath here as well. Do not desaturate monitor colors by 20% unless you have a very, very good reason for doing so and you know exactly what you're doing. This, I think, was put in here as an effort to provide some soft proofing, but there are much better ways to deal with soft proofing that we'll talk about in future videos. So just leave that alone, and likewise blend RGB colors. You can leave all of these last options alone. Now you could just hit OK at this point and we'd be done, but what I suggest you do rather than just hit OK is to actually save this out. So you can save this out as a preset. I would just call it photography because this is what we have, these are settings we have set up for specifically for photography, and it will save it in the correct place. You can see I've actually already got it saved in here as photography, so we don't need to hit save again. But by saving this out, it means that you can very quickly get back to it if you need to. You don't need to remember why you set things a certain way, they'll just be set correctly. And it also means you could actually even call it up with an action if you needed to in Photoshop as well. So there's some good reasons to save it there. So I'll just get out of that for now. So there you go. That's how you set up your color settings in Photoshop correctly, specifically for photography. If you're going out to CMYK or something like that, that's a different story. But specifically for working with photographs, this is how I suggest you set up your color settings in Photoshop, Creative Cloud. And if you do this, then you're going to make sure you don't get any wacky or unexpected color shifts. And you're also going to be prompted when you are copying and pasting documents into or out of Photoshop that might have different profiles as well. So by having these ticked down here. So that's it. Make sure you're doing this in Photoshop, and happy processing.